My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am your host. And today I'm joined by three behemoths and two figurative, one literal, and the literal one being John Flagg, because he is an absolute behemoth of a man. No offense, Quinn, Judd. But yeah. So, well, Quinn, you're very explosive, very athletic. So what you don't have in size, I guess you make up for in function.
Oh, thanks, Josh.
But for people who haven't read the title, kind of blindly clicked on this, we do have, again, three guests, John Flagg, Quinn Henoch, and Judd Kalkhoven. Was that was the correct pronunciation, Judd?
Yeah, spot on.
Awesome. And today we are going to talk a bit about load management, and I guess that's more of the buzzword. And specifically underneath that umbrella, we'll talk about injury risk, how that's related to the tissue's ability to tolerate some sort of force being applied through it, be it like an immediate application or repeated, kind of like a cyclical application. And for people listening, just keep in mind that, I happen to be a weightlifting coach and strength and conditioning enthusiast. I'm here to facilitate the conversation. So I'm going to let John, Quinn, and Judd kind of, worry about the very technical side of things and making sure that, when I say injury, I just kind of like casually say it, but it should probably be defined in a certain way. These concepts should be defined in a certain way. So like stress would have a very specific definition. Strain would have a very specific definition. And I'm sure they'll get into that stuff. But I just wanted to introduce it very generally. But before we get into that, the meat and potatoes of the conversation, I did want to, let each person introduce themselves. So Judd, since you are the first-time caller, first-time podcast guest, on this specific podcast, maybe we can start with you by getting your background and how you ended up becoming what we would consider an expert in muscle function.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. So I'm a researcher from the University of Technology, Sydney. I've actually just finished my PhD. Looking at muscle architecture, as well as a bunch of I guess training load related and injury risk related sort of conceptual works and frameworks. I guess my background is that I was raised in South Africa. You might hear I've got a South African accent. I moved to Sydney when I was 16, and then of course, been in Sydney ever since. So did my undergrad at UTS, so University of Technology, Sydney, did an honors, did my PhD, which I've just finished. And now I'm, I guess, a researcher, and I teach biomechanics at UTS.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there any specific instance or specific, I guess, thing or interest that led you down that exact path? And I'm sure it was, filled with a bunch of different decisions that ultimately led to the specific topic of your PhD, but how did you get put on that specific trajectory?
Yeah, so there's a few key things that happened. One is my principal supervisor is a guy called, Associate Professor Mark Watsford, and he had done a lot of research in tissue stiffness, but in applied sports settings. And, once I finished my undergrad, he sort of recruited me in a way, and said, I'm interested in this topic of stiffness, of tissue stiffness. Is this something that interests you? Would you like to go on and do further research? He actually gave me a list of topics, and stiffness was sort of the one that caught my eye, and he also had a keen interest in it. So we just sort of went down that route. And I started studying tissue stiffness, and this really evolved into trying to gain a detailed understanding of tissue mechanics. And then how this sort of evolved into my more recent works is quite a famous professor called Professor Franco Impellizzeri joined our team at UTS. And he's sort of one of the, I guess, training load gurus in sports science. I should be careful with the use of the word guru, but he's a genius when it comes to this sort of stuff. Like he's really brilliant in this area. And he was talking to me about a lot of the problems with relating training load to injury, and a lot of the talk about hamstring injury in particular. And it sort of made me go down the route of, what actually happens when someone tears their hamstring? Like if someone's sprinting at that moment in time, why did they tear their hamstring in that moment? And I think if you ask many, many researchers in this area that research, muscle injury and hamstring injury, I actually don't think they would have an answer. And that sort of led me around to asking questions, and no one could really answer this question for me. And I was kind of like, well, how are all these people providing all these solutions and interventions for something that we don't really understand that well how it actually happens, right? And from that, I just dived into muscle mechanics literature. So reading the really heavy papers, Lieber and Frieden are probably the two biggest names that I really started to read that. And that sort of started to open up to me a bunch of the, I guess, the shortcomings in the current applied research, which sort of led to me working on the papers that I ended up, putting out recently.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is we'll put a bookmark there, because I think, if we are going to have a discussion about training load or training load management and how that relates to reducing injury risk, I think something that you probably would hear about often, maybe less so now, is the acute on chronic workload ratio. And I do want to kind of come back to that, and then we can build from that point. But before we do, I mean, we have two other guests, so I figure I'll let them kind of introduce themselves before we get into that. So, Quinn, maybe you can start off. I don't think we've had a chat on a podcast in a while, so people might have forgotten who you are. So let's reintroduce them to Quinn Henoch.
Oh, my goodness. So I am a physical therapist, or a physiotherapist, as it's known everywhere else in the world, in Southern California. And my office is inside of a weightlifting gym being specifically the sport of weightlifting, snatch and clean and jerk, and any other barbell sport athletes that want to mosey in, and team and field sport athletes who use that type of training to augment their sport. And so my office is inside of a facility like that, which is really fun and it's awesome. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Practicing physiotherapist. I've competed in the sport of weightlifting for the last decade. Played American football after that, and I'm always the quote unquote athlete who is more so just kind of like struggling to stay afloat amidst the other really good athletes around me. And so I think with that experience, always trying to maximize performance, and then with my experience as a physical therapist dealing with injury scenarios, just trying to kind of blend those worlds, and that's what I geek out on. So conversations like this are a lot of fun.
And I know you're pretty heavily involved in weightlifting, but as a physical therapist, and you obviously run Clinical Athlete and do a lot of work trying to educate, but your weightlifting has been picking up too, and it's actually been looking really sharp. I think I saw a couple lifts the other day, and you weren't quite jumping back, and I thought, well, there you go, Quinn, looking fast, snappy, and technical.
Thanks, man. 10 years in, you're never too old.
Exactly. And then we also have John Flagg, who is another piece of the Clinical Athlete business, the powerlifting side, if you will. John, you were recently on a podcast where you talked about training injury setbacks, the performance rehab spectrum, stuff like that. But maybe you can give a quick background too, just for people who haven't listened to that episode.
Yeah, man, no problem. I think the biggest thing I'm learning today, though, is that I can relate Quinn to Dr. Dre. Like, how are you going to forget about Quinn, man? Come on, listeners. You can't forget about Quinn. Like Dr. Dre in here. So I'm probably best known for a dreary Sunday asking the Quinn Henoch if he would think it'd be cool to have a clinical athlete powerlifting certification, and getting the exact one-line response of, cool, yeah, when would you want to do that? So I do the clinical athlete powerlifting coaching certification, own Rebuild Stronger, which is an online coaching and rehab service for powerlifters and other strength athletes, weightlifters, and strongman competitors as well. And I've been doing the whole rehab and strength athlete thing really since I was 22. So 15 years now, working with that population and understanding and trying to get people to understand that injury is something that can be trained around. It is something that we can work through on a regular basis, and is kind of part of sport, as opposed to treating it like this giant event, and trying to help them work through that. I will say these conversations, especially with Judd, are incredibly compelling to me, because I remember when Quinn and I went down the AC ratio rabbit hole, and absolutely got our brains melted by Franco. I mean, melted by Franco. And it just spun our whole world around. So if there is people that we love to talk to, it's people like Judd and Franco that can really help us sharpen our intellectual tool set. So I'm excited for this one.
And I don't think people at home will appreciate it as much as I do, but John just created the most perfect segue to talking again where we kind of left off on the acute on chronic workload ratio, and how that does or doesn't really inform training prescription or kind of injury risk reduction. And Judd, maybe you can introduce exactly what that is, the acute on chronic workload ratio, and then we can talk about some potential pitfalls or problems with using it, or the benefits of using that to monitor training load.
Yep. So you're diving straight into the big one right off the bat. Yeah. So for those of you that haven't heard of the ACWR, it's pretty big in world sports, but essentially what you're using is 4 weeks of training data, which is representative of your training load, which is your chronic load, and then 1 week of training data, which is your immediate week, which represents your acute load. And essentially what you do is you put this into a ratio. So it's your acute to chronic workload ratio. And this metric was proposed as providing, predictive value in terms of injury, and to provide a viable assessment of injury risk. And this thing, of course, I think came out probably 4 or 5 years ago, caught on like wildfire in elite sport. And I think a lot of what my research group, in particular, headed by Franco, very much so, has challenged this metric for not being quite, what it was sort of brought out to be. How do you want me to tackle this? Because it's quite a heavy topic. I mean, I could just talk about some of the conceptual flaws that exist in it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I understand it as like again, kind of it's how it was directly applied to weightlifting. So I've spoken to coaches who in the past would take session RPE, multiply it by duration of the session. And to me, that never really made sense, given that a lot of training is in like these very discrete moments or discrete increments. So having, a 90-minute time period that would represent duration, but you lifted for say 5 minutes of it or 10 minutes of it. And having that kind of represent some of the training load or a metric that would inform decision-making, to me, that never made sense. So I guess going into some of the potential pitfalls or errors would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads to be honest. I guess first up to start off, let's talk about I'll talk about chronic load. So the 4 weeks of chronic load, that's been touted as having a protective effect on an athlete. So if your chronic load is high, right, you've been doing a lot of training for the past month, that's proposed as being indicative that this athlete's developed quite like a resilient base, right? So if your chronic load is low, so you essentially don't have much training in you, you're touted as being not so well prepared, not so resilient, right? So if your acute load is very high relative to your chronic load, so suddenly you haven't done much for a month, and then 1 week you just burn, the candles at both ends, and you go all out. You get this big spike in acute load, and then your acute to chronic workload ratio is very high, right? And you're going to have a high injury risk. Now, on face value, I get the attractiveness of that. Like that sounds like simple concepts that make sense, right? If you're unprepared going into a heavy session, that could be indicative of injury risk, of a heightened injury risk. Now, when you look into this a lot deeper, this is where the conceptual flaws begin to arise. So first one is really that you can use whatever metric you want within this ratio. So some team sports, they'll use GPS data, and they'll put 4 weeks of GPS data compared to 1 week of GPS data. Or as you mentioned, you can use RPE, or you can use, whatever you want really. And immediately that aspect of it rings massive alarm bells for me, because one is that these different measures of external and internal training load actually tell us completely different things. And some of these measures may be related to injury, some of them not, through a relevant causal pathway. And that immediately is something that is concerning, that you could use whatever you wanted essentially in this ratio. The other thing to consider is the quality of the data that is being collected in terms of, if I relate a GPS data to injury risk, right? A GPS only collects spatiotemporal variables. So how are these spatiotemporal variables actually causally related to an injury event? And the answer is it's very, very weak, this relationship. So in the papers that I've written, I talk a lot about mechanical load. So this is really referring to the forces experienced by specific tissue, right? So I'll give you an example. When you've got a runner and they're repeatedly running, and they develop stress fractures in their shin, right? What's happened is that they've experienced repetitive forces that have fatigued that shin bone until eventually stress fractures form. Now, if you try and capture these forces with a GPS unit, it's completely unviable. So there's a researcher called Matijevic who has produced some really great research recently. And what she did was, her and her group, they used accelerometers. So it actually gives you a better reading than a GPS unit. And they try to estimate the damage experienced by the tibia when running. And the error was 104%, right, with this accelerometer and trying to do this estimation. Like, not even close. Now, what they then did was they basically used a multi-sensor setup where they used accelerometers, pressure sensors, and a whole bunch of other data, and synced that using machine learning to try and provide targeted estimates of tibial damage. And they achieved essentially 18% error, which is phenomenal. But I think the message should be quite clear here, is that the actual data that we're inserting into the acute to chronic workload ratio is not particularly good data in relation to injury causality. And that's a big issue. The other thing is that all different injuries have vastly different mechanisms, right? There's loads of injuries that happen independent of training load. And so, how these metrics actually relate to specific types of injury is very, very speculative, very, very questionable as well. Now, I guess another big one, sorry if I'm going on a little bit here, but Franco and Pellizzeri and a few others released a paper, I think last year, showing that the actual ratio, using a ratio creates statistical artifact whereby so ratios are a little bit weird in that they rescale the data. And I don't want to go too much into this because Franco's spoken about this on other podcasts and it becomes quite technical. But essentially what it does is it creates statistically significant findings due to statistical artifacts. So they're not genuine statistically significant findings. So essentially what he showed is that all these studies that are showing, the acute to chronic workload ratio is associated with injury and the statistically significant findings, is that these findings are actually statistical artifacts caused by the use of a ratio. So from a statistics perspective, the ratio actually completely confounds the data, which means that we're essentially left with something that's not really usable. And I guess the next thing is I often get asked with the papers that I've released is, well, if we can't use that, well, surely something is better than nothing. And the answer to that is no. I firmly disagree, because if you have something that is constantly telling you something that is untrue in your decision-making framework, it's going to lead you to making decisions that are incorrect, right? It's something that you're factoring into your decision-making process that is telling you incorrect information. So it's actually harmful, and sometimes having something is not better than having nothing.
Yeah, I think my laptop just exploded because that was incredibly informative and really powerful, because it just got me thinking about how I'm informed by the information I collect. And it could be, not necessarily related to the acute on chronic workload ratio, but just information that if it isn't actually telling me what I think it's telling me, but it guides decision making, it actually could be harmful in that it affects performance negatively or kind of changes the outcome for the worse. So that was a very, very good point at the end. And then I would like to talk about the core tenet of that concept, at least the way I think about it, which is trying to manage the amount of stress and making sure that you're not, again, applying far too much stress too soon or too quickly, because some of the work you've done, you talk about tissue injury, again, as exceeding its ability to tolerate the forces applied to it. And Quinn, you've talked about this, and you actually did a roundtable with Spencer Arnold, who is the head coach at Power and Grace Performance, and he was showing us some of his programming and the way he tracks training volume or training load, and he was showing how he'll have these pretty extreme fluctuations and repetition, so like the number of reps performed in certain movements. And I know you normally talk about like this 10% change. Maybe you can kind of bring this more to the practical side of what the core tenet, I guess, would be of the acute on chronic workload ratio, and how that in a very reduced way could inform the managing of training load, and whatever way you would monitor that, which I guess could kind of confound it a bit, but whatever the way the coach would choose.
Okay, for using AC ratio specifically, or just training load in general?
Just kind of the concept that's built upon, right? So I guess it's my understanding, and the way that Judd, I think, explained it, is that you're trying to track this amount of stress that the athlete's used to, or that's applied over a period of time, and then you're trying not to make dramatic changes. And the way that where that's derived from can confound the quality or usefulness of it. But like the tenet of not changing training load too much too soon, does that still kind of hold and make sense? And how would that operate if the acute on chronic workload ratio isn't telling us anything useful?
Yeah. So how much is too much? What's too soon? What's too little? don't do too much too soon after doing too little for too long. Well, there's that descriptor to answer the question. I don't think we've really answered that question. You mentioned the 10% rule. If I've mentioned that in the past as something that has been suggested, but I've dug back to the root of that, and it comes from just expert opinion from the early 2000s, because it, I guess, kind of makes sense. Let's pick an arbitrary cutoff and say, well, 10% is not that much in most scenarios, so don't go past that from week to week and you should be fine. But that's, from a practitioner standpoint, from my perspective, highly individual. It's based on your knowledge of the training history of the individual, what they have responded well to and what they haven't responded well to in the past, and also what they have to look forward to. Because one way to maximize performance in a very short period of time is to spike training load. If you have to get to a certain level of performance and you've made the decision that we want to get here and we have a small window to do so, you're going to have to increase training load. And that may be at a level that's higher than what it's been in the past. What you're doing then is you're accepting the inherent risk that comes with that. It's not about preventing injury or minimizing risk at the same time that you're maximizing performance. Those things, they don't go in a linear fashion together. So with the AC ratios, it became this thing in barbell sport land where your people were actually almost creating their programs to spit out a certain ratio. So they were programming for the ratio as opposed to programming for the athlete. And the key performance indicator, or the outcome measure, became the ratio itself. It was as if we were competing in AC ratio and not in weightlifting or powerlifting or whatever the sport may be. And as Judd mentioned, I won't get into the limitations of the metric specifically, because Franco and then their team have done a phenomenal job of that. But a ratio is a very specific thing. When we say, there's a sweet spot of AC ratio of 0.8 to 1.3, that's a very specific recommendation. And that has to be specific to the metric. Let's just even assume that the ratio itself is valid. You would that each metric and each population would have to have their own specific ratio to even be able to have an apples to apples conversation. And that certainly hasn't been done. So here we are in barbell sport land using completely different metrics like tonnage, average intensity across sets, maybe SRPE load, and then trying to plug this into a specific ratio that was used for, rugby and cricket. So it just doesn't work like that, where you're trying to fit various metrics into something that it's levels removed from the population, the sport, and everything in that regard. So from my perspective as a practitioner, the AC ratios don't currently have a place. In regards to the spiking of load up and down, you mentioned my conversation with Spencer Arnold, where he pulled up graphs. He pulled up graphs of two different athletes. One athlete was a male, two Olympians, by the way. One was a female, one was a male. The female is smaller in just size and can handle really high volumes of load. And when you looked at the graphs, though, the fluctuations weren't very big. It was like just high chronic load all the time, because she can handle a lot of work. The other athlete, male lifter, he can't really handle high chronic loads across long periods of time. So what Spencer figured out for this individual athlete was that this athlete responds really well when we build, but then we need a hard period of deload. So that's much different than getting into this spin cycle of all or nothing, or this like rehab purgatory where you're spiking your load, trying to like make up for lost time. And then you fall off the cliff and you're back to ground zero. And it's just never ending cycle. And you're not making any progress. Spencer was planning these undulations in training for an athlete who responds well to them. He learned that he responds well to them by iterating over time. and updating his kind of mental model of this athlete as new information would come in. So that's a very different thing than just like arbitrarily quadrupling your training load and then taking a 3-week vacation.
Yeah, and I realized with my words that I kind of painted you into a bit of a box. So I'm glad you were able to take something from that and run with it. As far as the timeline goes, and John, I want to kick you a question after this, but as far as the timeline goes, that AC ratio, it talks about like a 4-week chronic number. Does that what's like, because when I think of that, I kind of think of that idea of block periodization. You train for 3 weeks and then you kind of unload, and that seems to be optimal based on some reason that ISRN, I guess, came up with. Judd, is there any like validity to using a 4-week, I guess, like average for anything, or was that kind of just...
Yeah, so first I just want to say everything Quinn said I completely agree with, right? You need to manage the athletes, and I think I do see this. I think a lot of practitioners in elite sports are looking for a computer to tell them what to do. And I don't think we're even close to that. I think you always need to manage the athlete, get to know your athlete, and see what they can cope with, and learn by having a strong communication and relationship with them. So your question is essentially, is chronic load, so 4 weeks of load data, does that act as a surrogate for athlete resilience? It's essentially, I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth. That's essentially what you're asking me, right? Yeah. Now this is interesting. So Franco's actually looked a lot into chronic load here, and he's basically as well shown that there's actually no evidence that 4 weeks of load data acts as a surrogate for athlete resilience in any way either. And I think, conceptually, athlete resilience is developed over a number of years of long-term training, right? I think this idea that we can put some really simple data inputs, for example, GPS data, and just take 4 weeks of that, and that can somehow explain this athlete's, whole body resilience to a whole bunch of different injuries with different mechanisms is really wishful thinking. I mean, there's a couple other things I want to say about the acute to chronic workload ratio. So I mentioned the data inputs. I mentioned the statistical artifact. Something to consider is with the ratio, right? If you have, let's just use arbitrary values. Let's say you have a chronic load of 100, and then 1 week you have an acute load of 200. So your load has increased by 100, right? Your acute to chronic workload ratio is going to be 2. It's going to put you at a super high risk, but your chronic load has only gone up by 100, right? Now let's say your chronic load is now 1,000. If you go up by 100, so you're only on 1,100, you've still gone up by 100 on your load, but now your ratio is only 1.1. So now you're at extremely low risk. So in both scenarios, you've gone up by the same amount in absolute terms, but you have very different outcomes in terms of what it suggests your injury risk is. One, you are in extremely high risk. The other one, you are in no risk at all. Now, conceptually looking at that weighting from the ratio as well, is that if your chronic loads are really high, that means that to be at any risk whatsoever, your acute load needs to be completely through the roof. Like, let's say it's 1,000, which is very high. Like, you need to increase your load by like 50% to be at a very high risk, right? Now, if you've got an athlete, and you can imagine if they're doing a month of like a heavy load, and you're pushing them, close to breaking point, conceptually that doesn't make sense to me, that they're almost like indestructible if you're pushing them near max capacity. Like, we know that athletes have ceilings, and that you get this increase in performance is not this linear increase that just goes on forever. Like, it actually curves off. So, if your chronic load is extremely high, based on the ratio, it almost makes you like indestructible. Even if you're pushing yourself to breaking point, it says that you can go up another 20%. Like, there's no ways that's correct. So yeah, there is a lot of issues in terms of, especially in the use of the ratio, what chronic load means, and how it works in the ratio. But even independent of the ratio, there's not strong evidence at all that 1 month of training load data can actually be used as an appropriate surrogate of athlete resilience.
Well, and John, you as a practitioner, someone who coaches a lot of powerlifters, how do you decide on the fluctuations in, say, a training load or training volume? Maybe with the initial prescription of a program with someone who you've never worked with, because that could in and of itself create a huge spike or a huge dip. And then any changes within the longer term plan, what's the decision-making process look like for altering training load?
I mean, for me, it's going to be performance, like their objective performance and their subjective reporting and feedback. Spencer, I love that we actually brought up Spencer, because I followed a lot of his programs back in the day when I was a weightlifter, and have pulled a lot of inspiration from, Spencer and Quinn and the weightlifting world. And when you look at these things, the acute to chronic workload ratio was super sexy, right? I go back to when Judd was talking about trying to find the answer for the hamstring strain, and nobody knew. And now all of a sudden we all thought we knew, like, oh, you spiked your workload and that was what it was. And instead, when it comes to making informed decisions, you look at performance. So is performance increasing in the key metrics that I want? So in powerlifting, it's going to be whatever squat variation, bench variation, or deadlift variation we're currently working on. Is that improving? And then how does the athlete feel? And this is when we start talking about subjective data. And when it comes to a lot of this stuff that Judd's talking about, he cleared this up in our podcast. Like, that's just not something in a lot of the research that is even needed to talk about. But when it comes to the practical application, how they feel, how they're reporting. Do I feel beat to crap? Judd brings up, if you got somebody on the bleeding edge and they're at workloads that are really chronically high, and they feel beat up, and they feel all these other things that these athletes typically report, then it's probably time to back off a little bit. That's just smart training, smart coaching, and listening to your athlete. There are other times where you can watch them and say, okay, we can push this a little bit longer and go. There is a little bit of an art to it with all of this science, but it's always going to be based off the KPIs, the performance metrics that we find important as coach athlete, and their feedback and individual athlete response to their perceived experience as well. And that is something that isn't really what is involved with like this AC ratio as well. There are, like, I love talking about it too, because we talk about the far end. We talk about the bleeding edge of performance. We also don't talk about there are individuals that think they're training hard, that aren't really training hard. And then if, as a coach, if you're looking for that 2.0, you're looking for, I'm just going to stay in this range based off an SRPE. What if the SRPE is not accurate as a lifter? Now we've got another hole to poke in this. What if you're not lifting with intent? What if you're not lifting or doing the activity to 100%? Now all of a sudden that's out the window. It doesn't matter.
So when we talk about injury, and maybe Judd, you can kind of give us some insight into what we would mean in this context, but like a tissue's capacity has been exceeded, and there's some acute change in the structure of the function. Is that able to be predicted by anything, really? I mean, you talked about like subjective information, but like, how would you anticipate the exceeding the capacity of any tissue, given that I don't know of any like reliable indicators that it's to excess?
No, that's a good question. My answer is right now, I do not believe there's anything available to really give us that quality of data to know that. So just conceptually, right, if we want to, I guess, predict with a high level of accuracy and capture this phenomenon of injury, if I look at the example of the tibia when running that I used earlier, there's really two things we need to quantify with a high level of accuracy. One is the mechanical strength of that bone, right? And the other being the mechanical loads experienced by that bone. And if we could accurately do that, then we could do some really great estimates of injury risk and predictions of injury. Now, it's very complex to do that actually, because if you look at the mechanical strength of any tissue, it's dependent on a myriad of factors that all are part of a complex system that contribute to its strength. So the architecture of the tissue, the morphology, the mechanical characteristics, all of these contribute to the strength of that. The mechanical loads as well, that's pretty hard to determine. The best approach I've seen by far was that Matijevic paper that I mentioned earlier, where I think relative to a lot of the research that was out in training load really sort of just looked at accelerometer based data and looking at like very basic sort of indicators of load that actually weren't valid in determining the mechanical load, right? Where Matijevic actually did this, highly complex syncing of data to try do targeted estimates of the damage. Now, for bone and for tendon and for those sorts of tissues, I'm actually very confident that going forward, we're going to come up with some really great solutions to that. Muscle has an added complexity, which makes me more hesitant to be as confident with it. And the complexity of muscle is that through activation and the generation of muscle tensions and the increase in stiffness is you actually completely alter the mechanical characteristics of musculature. So unlike bone and tendon, where it's a pretty stable structure, like those characteristics aren't changing in the short term, muscle, just by activating it, you really change those characteristics dramatically. So the way that tissue actually interacts with the force that it experiences is highly dependent on the muscle state at that point in time. And that makes it very, very complex, especially when you're looking at things like hamstring injury when sprinting. Like, how do you factor in something like the acute neuromechanical regulation of musculature at that point in time? So in terms of muscle, during activities such as sprinting, that's a very, very, very complex problem to solve. I know this. I guess your podcast is more to do with weightlifting. The thing that interests me with weightlifting and load management is that I actually, even though I haven't done that much research in weightlifting per se, it actually interests me more. And the reason it interests me more is because in weightlifting, you actually use a physical weight that has been weighed and has a measurement on it, which is a mechanical load, right? So what you can use as your indicators of load is actually highly representative of the mechanical loads that are being placed on the tissue. So opposed to using a GPS, which is just spatiotemporal data and then trying to estimate forces from that, you actually have a physical weight in weightlifting. So it's a much better proxy of the stresses that tissues are actually being exposed to during that activity.
Well, and I'm wondering how. So you talk about how a muscle interacts with the forces that are applied, and how basically when it activates, that kind of confounds things. But after reading one of your papers, I think it was talking about the conceptual framework.
Yep.
You talked about like contextual factors, and the way I kind of read that was like the individual differences, and I could be reading it a bit incorrectly, but how would individual differences between people, assuming like in weightlifting, maybe similar skill levels or preparedness, how do those influence risk of injury or risk of like some sort of overuse injury or something like that?
That's a very good question. John actually mentioned something along these lines that I wanted to touch on, because I want to talk about injury risk, and I actually think injury risk is in many ways a poisoned chalice, right? And the reason I say that is that research that looks at injury risk, that's a descriptive type of research study that only assesses the risk, and risk is assessed per like a certain amount of time that you're exposed to something. So it could be like risk of injury per, however many hours or whatever it is. Now, that's some useful information, but the problem is that if we're looking from like an injury prevention perspective, right? If there's a very famous paper, I think it's from 1992 by Van Mechelen, and it's basically it's called the sequence of prevention, and it's an adaptation of really the purpose of science, but just for injury prevention purposes, and it's a very simple model. All it is that you assess the problems in a given sport in terms of which injuries are problematic and occur and whatnot. The second step is, okay, find the causal mechanisms of this injury. And the third step is create intervention strategies based on these causal mechanisms. And then the fourth step is just reassess and see how effective your interventions are. Now, studies that assess risk do not disclose the causal mechanisms that influence this injury risk. And this is very important because it means that you can't actually strategize against preventing this injury just because you have assessments of this risk per se. And I'll give you an example of when this is important. Now, in sport, because we just really look at risk relative to the time aspect, now there's a very, I guess, delicate balance between, or not delicate balance, but a balance that occurs whereby as you get stronger, you're going to lift heavier. Like as you get faster, you start to, as you develop as an athlete, you begin to run faster. And what this means is that, let's say you've got two powerlifters. One bench presses 200 kilos, the other one bench presses 100 kilos. So it's a lot weaker. The guy who benches 200 kilograms could have, far superior tissue characteristics by all means. So superior in every way. But because he's lifting 200 kilos and the other guy's lifting 100 kilos, their risk of injury when bench pressing could be the same, right? And this is important because if you look at something like sprinting, whereby you just look at as time, time sprinting or time playing soccer, that data is not captured. You can have players that are extremely explosive and have amazing tissue characteristics, and other players that aren't explosive at all and not particularly great tissue characteristics. But those that are explosive with the great tissue characteristics can have a higher risk of injury. And what that means is our causal inferences in terms of, this factor is associated with a higher risk, or this factor is associated with a higher risk, can be very dangerous because, certain factors can actually be protective, but get implicated with being at a higher risk because, there's increases in other confounding factors that are actually causal to the injury mechanism. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering, and this was a question I did have based on the kind of the timeline of adaptation to different tissues. Is that what would kind of enforce some resiliency? Is it takes time to get strong if you're not enhanced, and that timeline also helps kind of I guess like make the tissues more resilient as you get stronger. They kind of develop together, as opposed to someone who starts a cycle of some performance enhancing drug, get really strong really quickly, and then the tissues didn't have time to adapt, and they're at a much greater risk, even though the force production's higher. to match the weight on the bar, but it's because there wasn't like that adaptation period in between.
That's a good example, because I think I'm correct in saying that athletes that take performance enhancing drugs are often at risk of tendon ruptures because their muscles adapt to produce all this force, but their tendons take longer to adapt, for example. But yeah, I mean, you touched on it. The risk by itself is very misleading. What you need to look at is the risk to the performance output. And this is really what matters. Like, you need to look at, what is this athlete doing? Are they a superior athlete? And like one of the things I've often heard is that, okay, injury risk hasn't really improved across a multitude of sports over a number of decades. And, people see this as like a failure in many ways. And, I think you would hope that the risk, we would determine better ways. And I think we will determine better ways to improve this risk. But something to consider is that athletes compared to 30 years ago are way more developed. Like, their performance outputs are way higher. And, I'm a big rugby fan. If I compare what rugby athletes are today to what they were 30 years ago, I think they're 20 kilograms bigger on average. The intensity of the performance that is occurring is much, much higher. So even though from just a descriptive risk perspective per whatever many hours playing, we're seeing similar outcomes, I don't think that's actually a fair reflection of what's going on. I think these athletes, the forces they're producing are so much higher. The forces they're exposed to by other athletes, these contacts are way, way more impactful. And they're being able to tolerate this. So yeah, I think risk by itself is actually something to be very cautious of. It doesn't tell you how to actually intervene, and without understanding the athletic output that's occurring, it's actually very limited in what it's telling you, if not misleading. You really need to look at the whole picture, which I think John was talking about earlier as well, with performance, a big focus on performance.
Yeah, you don't see guys built like Joe Marler 20 years ago, man. Like that the rugby pitch has changed. The athlete has changed in general. I mean, the men and women that are competing right now are doing unreal things. And to touch on that, like if we're not seeing injury rates increase with that performance, Quinn and I have talked quite a bit about, like, the closer you want to fly to the sun, the harder you want to push something to get a particular outcome, then it's almost just acceptable risk. And I love, Judd, this is one of these moments where I got to pick my brain up off the ground, right? Where you talk about risk almost being like a poison chalice, because it's almost like it's a half answer. It makes us feel like we've got an answer, but to really, in my scientific mind, to really say that we can assess risk would mean that we'd actually be able to put like a measurable number. And instead, we're just kind of spitballing. It's like, okay, well, this happened, so you were probably at increased risk because of X, Y, Z. Instead of actually being able to say, well, this is an actual objective measure as to why your risk was increased. Yeah. We don't know that. We don't have that. And just bringing up the muscular contraction structure and how it's like we're looking at trying to predict a moving target with a randomized movement.
Yeah,
like that. We're throwing darts at something that's getting bigger and smaller and moving around all over the place, and we don't know where it is.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of wondering, because I hear that athletes are much better and that they more forceful, which would mean they're stronger and likely faster. But is that a product of a different sample? And this might be kind of a dumb question, but is it because more people are participating in sports now, we have a bigger sample to pull from, more genetic variation or variety? And then how would that, if that's at all correct, how would genetic variation between individuals influence injury risk, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's just the growing professionalism of sport as well. Like, if you look at sticking with the example of rugby, I mean, 30 years ago, rugby, I don't think was even professional or barely professional, right? So, I mean, now they're treated like stallions, these athletes now, compared to what they were 30 years ago. So I think that's a big aspect. I mean, like strength training in particular wasn't so big, a few decades ago, where that's a big component of elite sports now. So I think just with increased knowledge, increased scientific knowledge, we've learned these ways to develop our athletes and look after our athletes better. I mean, in terms of genetic variation, yeah, I mean that of course plays a massive role in injury risk. I mean, if you're looking at contact sports, if you've got big guys versus little guys, in any of those contacts, the little guys are going to be worse off, right? But I mean, there's loads of genetic factors. I mean, everything from your fiber type to how your body metabolizes food to how you develop muscle, develop power. All of that is all part of the complex system that would determine your injury risk in any different scenario. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a highly specific answer for you, just because genetics influences pretty much everything, right? From the strength of your bones to the power you can produce to how your muscles function. Like it's obviously a critical factor.
Yeah, and it almost seems somewhat meaningless to bring up if it's unchangeable. Like you can't change your height necessarily, so why even talk about height with respect to risk? But I mean, I guess you could influence other aspects of it with like nutrition and obviously resistance training. But a lot of it is kind of so under the surface that I don't know what it would contribute. Quinn, you've been pretty quiet. Maybe we can get some commentary from you on the conversation.
Okay. I mean, I'm just taking it all in, man. This is great. Risk is, in order to calculate risk, you hypothetically would know all of the unknowns. And what I mean by that is you will be able to take all of the factors that both Judd and John talked about, all the contextual factors surrounding this scenario of the athlete, be able to assign probabilities of their coming to fruition, and then weight those factors based on what you think is most important. And the aggregate is some type of risk, assuming we know all of the unknowns. But in a complex system, that is impossible. And so this is why we use heuristic-based thinking, like 10% rule, or like just focusing on performance and not worrying about programming for risk, is because there's really no way to calculate all of those known unknowns. What we mostly have are unknown unknowns. And let's say we even did, then the conversation needs to be had in terms of relative versus absolute risk, because I can say that you've increased your risk by 50%, but if your risk was only 1% to begin with, then a relative risk increase of 50% just takes you to another absolute low risk increase, or low risk in general. So you always have to say, anytime we're talking about risk or percentages, it's percentage of what? Relative to what? Relative to what prevalence of risk? And going back to some of the AC ratio, first of all, to your past question, Josh, of like 4 weeks, I've seen studies use 3-week chronic loads, 6-week chronic loads. It's all arbitrary. 4 weeks is used most often probably just because it fits the calendar. Just like periodization, month makes sense. A week for a microcycle makes sense. But those are also on group averages. So let's just assume the metric is valid. We're looking at a group average. When you whittle down to the individual, those numbers don't necessarily apply because of the bell curve. So that's where, because of all of those factors, is why I whittle down to programming for the performance and making decisions just based on what I feel the athlete's going to be able to handle. I think the idea of minimizing risk just kind of inherently, like, we don't want our athletes to get hurt. Obviously, they need to be available. the best programming is going to allow them to just be available to do their thing. But when we're prioritizing performance, and if I prioritize performance, I'm thinking, well, I want them to be able to continue to be able to do this. So inherently, I am trying to decrease their risk because I want them to keep coming back to the gym. But the preventing injury is not at the forefront of why I'm programming the things that I'm programming, if that makes sense. And then the other piece of this conversation, which is super interesting to me, and maybe Judd can speak on just with his research on tissue specifically, is this idea of specific tissue adaptations. And specifically for me, it's tendon, especially for in barbell sports and the sport of weightlifting. We tend to not see very many muscular injuries. We see joint stuff, and we see tendon things, tendinopathies or tendinopathy type presentations, and it makes sense because the loads are repeated. They're training quite frequently and these types of things. But in like 2010, it was this Peter Magnuson paper where they looked at like martial artists, and they had them kick a bunch of times, and then they looked at tendon serum collagen levels, where basically like after a big load of work, they would see this collagen degradation period after like 24 hours or within 24 hours, and they'd see a spike in collagen synthesis. And then they took from that like, oh, okay, so then we need to, if you load your tendons a lot, you need to take 24 hours off, and then you can load them again. And when I was thinking about that, and that's since changed because there's research showing that like the core of a tendon doesn't really change after adolescence. So it's like, oh, what the hell? We don't even know where that serum collagen was going. They were just like, oh, it increased. So that must be, if it degrades, it must be bad. If it increases in their serum, it must be good. But when you think about like high level athletes, they train every day. They jump and run. If they're martial artists, they're kicking every day. If they're weightlifters, they're training multiple times a week, back to back to back. So the tissue specific adaptations is one that kind of makes my head scratch a little bit, where we know that tendons adapt slower, but we don't necessarily know how to modulate the rate of performance to accommodate that slower adaptation, but to also kind of move the needle from a performance perspective. And that's kind of an open question to John or Judd, to like balance the phenomenological idea of like, we want to just increase their ability to do the task that matters, versus this like ontological thing where we're taking a like tissue specific adaptation lens. And those two things compete for me.
Yeah. Oh, well, so I want to talk about what you first said earlier, which I think is an important part, is programming for performance. I think I mentioned this on your podcast, Quinn and John, but I think a good way to function is set your goals from a performance perspective, right? What is it that you need your athlete to achieve? What are your goals as an athlete? What are your goals as a coach? And you set those and be firm on those, and you do what you need to do to achieve that. And that sets the paradigm for which your injury risk mitigation strategy must function. So like a lot of the research in regards to strategies that mitigate risk often don't consider the impact on performance and training that their strategies suggest, right? And this is of course problematic. Like an example is, we know sidestepping it increases the risk of ACL injury, right? So some of the papers, the strategies are almost like often they're telling you to detrain your athletes, or like don't sidestep or whatever it is. And it's like, of course, that's not a viable solution, because from a performance perspective, no elite athlete would ever do these strategies. So it's really reconciling the goals of the athletes from a performance and training perspective, which takes priority. And then the goal is to minimize the risk without harming those pursuits, right? And I think a lot of the research hasn't quite comes to terms with that. I think we still need to reconcile how our strategies actually impact performance, and how best to implement that. I guess onto Quinn's second part about tissue adaptation. Yeah, that's a very detailed question. I don't have a clear answer. I mean, yeah, tissue adaptation is a very complex topic especially to try and model and estimate the adaptation that occurs and whatnot. I honestly believe for a big part is that experience. I would, if you guys probably know a lot more about weightlifting and powerlifting than I do. I mean, I do weightlift, but not to the level that I think you guys do. I mean, I very much lean towards the side of trusting expertise, of high level powerlifters and whatnot. I think some of the science can often confound things, and to get a clear direction where the science really dictates things to a high level is very, very difficult to achieve. Yeah, I mean, Quinn, I'm not an expert in tendons per se. It's a route I would like to go down, but I don't wanna yeah, just spitball and make stuff up. I don't have a clear answer for you.
Yeah, I know John has like 15 minutes, and which kind of bums me out a little bit, but I did have a couple questions. And again, this kind of comes back to things we take for granted in training, and a lot of the concepts are kind of like on face value make sense, but then when you try to really think about them and think about the practicality of them, it starts to get a little fuzzy. And one concept is work capacity. So increasing like the work capacity, like someone's work capacity, ability to tolerate training, and then a tissue's capacity. And it's, typically the prescription is like, do some isolation work, some isolation exercise work. And that's kind of where it leads you. And then it's like, okay, do you do 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 15, 5 sets of 15? Like what's happening when you target a muscle specifically that enhances its ability to tolerate like repeated contractions? And then as far as like prescription of that, I guess, Judd, you can tackle the changes at the muscular level, but then Quinn or John, you can talk about what the actual prescription of something like that would be, given that like a lot of these concepts in training are very open-ended and kind of like casually talked about without much specifics or detail, because I think it is hard to come up with something that's got a lot of evidence, and it's not just really arbitrary like 3 sets of 10 or 5 sets of 10.
So Josh, I'm going to jump in real quick because I want to answer Quinn's question with a very clear I don't know, but kind of the balance of that builds off the answer that I kind of have to your question here in particular, and builds off a couple of things we already touched on before. When you look at injury rates within sport and you look at particular body part injury rates within sport. So in powerlifting, 3 really common areas that you see are low back, shoulder, and knee pain. So as a coach, one of the things that I try to do is add in isolated or accessory work for those 3 spots in an attempt to build some resiliency and strength within those areas. That's not to say that strength is an indicator of injury risk, but I just want those typical areas to not be a weak point in the lift. One of the things that I really struggle with when we start talking about some of these as well is we always have it devoid of skill. When we talk about weightlifting, powerlifting, or really any other sport that we're going to talk about here, when we eliminate skill from the conversation, that's another confounding factor that can add some difficulty. Judd mentioned that through the contraction spectrum of a muscle, things change, the properties change. Well, if the load and stressors are coming from different positions every single time you do a rep, and we know there's variability even in elite lifters, from rep to rep to rep, or from movement to movement to movement, is that really something that we can pin down? We can work on skill on the bigger stuff. We can work on squat, bench, and deadlift and try to get stuff nailed down. and do our best to balance, with some isolation work, typical weak points or historically difficult points with a particular lifter. If you have a history of back pain or a history of particular injury, I'm probably going to focus on that with some of the other things that we do. And that's all going to be lifter dependent and with the person who's in front of me and making, good choices. Make good choices.
I think John's touched on an important point there. Actually, like we talk about tissue loading and tissue strength, but and at the fundamental of injury, that's what occurs, right? The force is applied to a tissue and overloads it, but there is a mechanism that results in that, and often John's right. The skill components, maybe an incorrect technique or a technical flaw, can be the primary aspect that determines that tissue getting overloaded. So yes, we can act on the tissue strength to build resilience in that tissue strength. But from a mechanistic perspective, maybe that's not the most important aspect of many injuries. There's certain injuries where it will be extremely important, but there's other injuries that the mechanism and preventing the mechanism of loading on that tissue could actually be the better place to act. So it's it's a different strategy, even though the fundamental of the injury is that a tissue gets overloaded. There's other aspects along the causal pathway that are very important to consider.
And I want to let Quinn speak on this real quick, but I want to add just a layer of clarity here too. What we're not saying is that technique is also super, super dependent on injury. It's an efficiency thing. If you deviate from technique, you're not going to end up in Snap City instantaneously. Like, that's not how this works. However, from even a physiological standpoint, we want you to be efficient, especially as we get towards those higher absolute loads. I love the comparison previously Judd made about the 100 kilo bencher and the 200 kilo bencher. Absolute load makes a difference, and efficiency in that mechanism is going to make a difference. So technique does matter from an efficiency standpoint, but we don't want to be like, oh, if you deviate from it, then you're done, because it just doesn't work that way either.
So Josh, you mentioned you wanted me to speak about muscle resilience. So yeah, there's I guess the fundamentals of a tissue resilience, and for anyone that wants to go look this up, is really to study the stress strain curve, right? So the stress strain curve, essentially what it tells us is stress refers to the force per cross-sectional area of a structure or tissue. So let's see it as force, right? So stress is force. Strain essentially refers to length change, so stretch. So you can think of that as stretch. So if you think of an example of an elastic band, you apply force to an elastic band, which is the stress, and then that elastic band will stretch, right? So if you've got a structure that is very, very stiff, I'll give you an example, let's just say a steel pole. If you want to break that steel pole, you need to transfer a lot of energy into it, right? Apply a lot of stress, a lot of force, and it might not strain very much before it breaks. So it can tolerate a lot of stress, but maybe not so much strain. Where on an elastic band, for example, it's very easy to stretch. You don't need to apply a lot of stress, but it can tolerate a lot of strain. It can stretch, very far before it breaks, right? So musculature, being able to acutely regulate its mechanical properties, can essentially go into almost both of these states, right? If you down activate your muscle, down regulate your muscle activation, your muscle can lengthen to full range. Whereby when your muscle is highly, highly active, it's highly, highly stiff. And when it's highly stiff, it doesn't tolerate strain so well. So the question is, how do you maximize the strength of your tissue? But not just that when it comes to musculature. It's how can you get your muscle to regulate its mechanical properties based on the demands placed on it? Now, in things like sprinting, where you have a very delicate balance between the muscle activation, the lengthening of the hamstring, and the tensions that it needs to hold, where you've got this very unique, highly specific pattern, that's incredibly important. With weightlifting, it's really a high level of activation. But I mean, still to do the eccentric portion and the concentric portion, you're down regulating and up regulating your activation in order to achieve these things. You're manipulating these mechanical characteristics. So part of it is, okay, how do I get my muscle to tolerate stress? And the main answer for that is you need to get strong, right? You need to get strong, and force is very much, it's pretty much synonymous with stiffness of the muscle. The higher the force, the higher the stiffness of the muscle, and that's going to make the muscle resist being stretched and strained, right? And then by lengthening out various structures in the musculature, fascicle length is a very popular topic in sports science, which is essentially the length of the muscle fibers, meant to be representative, is that you allow the muscle to tolerate strain a lot better as well, which means that it becomes more comfortable being actively lengthened into larger ranges. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you did bench press, but you're only doing half range, every time you trained. You could get incredibly strong in that range, but you're adapting your muscle only to function in that range. If you're forced into positions where it has to now function in lengthened positions, right, it's not going to have adapted to be able to tolerate that well at all. None of those structures that actually maintain the integrity of the musculature will be used to experiencing such high levels of tension through these extended ranges that it needs to function, right? So it's really about developing ways to increase the stress tolerance and the strain tolerance of the muscle, and then being able to regulate its functionality as per the mechanical demands that are placed on it. So yeah, muscle is something that's very, very complex. But I guess part of my research that I'm trying to do now is create models for muscular resilience that can help guide our strategies for our interventions of how we actually reduce the risk of muscle injury and increase functionality and its ability to cope with stress and strain.
Yeah, and I guess the entire podcast has talked about why it's difficult to assess and predict injury risk. Where is there a trajectory for the research to help inform that? Is there actually some sort of predictor or answer out there, or something that can give us more insight? Or is this, it'd be hard to say no, or it'd be hard to say entirely yes, but is there a path forward? And Judd, someone who does research a lot of these concepts or read and write about them quite a bit, where do you see the research heading to help inform us further?
Yeah, so I would really like to see the construction of highly detailed conceptual frameworks for specific types of injuries. So looking at injury causality from contextual factors all the way to the overload of the tissue. One of the things I'm working on, I mentioned, is a model for muscle resilience. I think for muscle, the way I'm sort of approaching it is that I think we're going to be stuck with just addressing risk factors that we know are associated with a higher risk, right? And I'm really trying to base this model on factors that influence muscular resilience and functionality, but at a quite a detailed level, and then make some proposals on how we can strategize based on this knowledge that we have on how muscles function and tolerate stress and strain and whatnot. In terms of other tissues, even though there's nothing right now, I think we can do some really incredible work in terms of if we can accurately determine the mechanical loads placed on these tissues that are a little less complex than musculature in various ways. that we can do some really high level injury risk assessments that are, very, very useful for various athletes in various contexts. So I definitely see a way forward. I think there's quite exciting pathways that we can now see, potential avenues in which we can, almost solve a series of injuries that are important injuries to athletes. So.
Wow, very optimistic. That's exciting. And then Quinn and John, I don't know if you guys want to supply any takeaways from this, or you did a good job of kind of taking it and applying a practical lens. But what can the listeners kind of take away from this, hour and 20 minutes of conversation about injury risk and all the surrounding factors?
Go ahead, Quinn.
I was going to say, go ahead, John. What you're doing right now is if your athletes are having success, there's a lot of things that you can see and read, and you may feel like you're missing out on. Don't feel that way just yet. I think to Judd's point that we're heading in really exciting directions, and there's a lot of exciting things that are going to come out from a research side that hopefully the practitioners can pick up, but the basics are going to still reign supreme. So pay attention to, what the individual responds to. If they have a problem, understand that programming is one aspect of the stress that goes into that system, but there's many, many other factors. So, try to troubleshoot in terms of what you think is providing the biggest stress or filling the stress bucket the most, but these are always going to be best guesses, and just stay flexible within your processes, and be okay with tinkering and iterating on your program and your processes, and I guess just stick to the basics. They're working now, and they'll probably continue to work. So that's where I'll leave off.
Yep.
Yeah, agreed with Quinn. Humans are messy, so if you're looking for perfect, then you're probably looking for the wrong thing. Discussions like this are incredible. I learn something new every single time I talk to somebody like Judd. So thank you so much, Josh, for putting this together. But if you're a coach out there and you're wondering how to make the whole thing perfect, you're looking for the wrong thing. That is imposter syndrome rearing its head. People are messy. It's always going to be messy. The best you can do is just be the best informed. That's going to be listening to your athlete, and then listening to great podcasts like this. So thanks again, Josh.
Yeah, no problem. And my little spiel would be, there is a lot of uncertainty with it, and that's okay. And again, the flexibility piece is huge. So just to reiterate what Quinn said, and for me, it's finding a way to build that flexibility into the system, because the Mike Tashir quote, "Systems drive behavior." So you have to have a system that can help drive useful behavior. Guys, where can people find you if they want to read more, know more, learn more, get some coaching? Judd, maybe we can start with you. Where can people find your research and read all about it?
I guess the easiest way to find my research is just go on Google Scholar and search my name. My research should be there. To be honest, I don't have that much out there. But I've got a few papers that I'm quite proud of that I think are worth the read. And then I'm working on a load more that I'm sitting on and hope to release over the next year or so. If you want to contact me, my email is just judd.kalkhoven@uts.edu.au. Alternatively, I've got Twitter, so you can just search me up on Twitter. You should be able to find me. Awesome. Quinn, where can people get a hold of you?
Instagram's good. Quinn.Henoch DPT, any of the clinical athlete channels on Instagram or Facebook, clinicalathlete.com. And I think you will be able to find me.
Okay. And John, you can round us out.
Instagram's the best place. John.rebuildstronger. That's where I'm the most active. So shoot me a message on there. I'm an open book. Love to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I would highly suggest if you have any questions or comments, concerns, whatever, feel free to reach out to any of these guys. I'm sure they have a much more thought out answer than I could ever come up with. You can find me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PHILWL. You can follow the weightlifting club at Clintonville Barbell. And we will catch you next time on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.